Hey, it's Mark from Power BI at Work. Thanks for joining another video where in this video, we're going to talk about the DAX function TREATAS. I like TREATAS because whenever I'm in a bind with my model and I've got all the relationships drawn out, when I need to evaluate something using an alternative relationship that I don't necessarily want to draw in my model because it may create ambiguity, um, it may just complicate my model that's already efficient. I can call on TREATAS and use it as a very efficient way to create an alternate relationship. So we're going to go through TREATAS. First off, I'll point out that in DAX Guide, they point out that it's a table. It returns a table. So it's a table expression when it comes to our calculate steps. And then up here in the definition, I want to read this and just point something out. TREATAS treats the columns of an input table. So we're going to see as we get rolling with TREATAS is that it takes two arguments. It's going to take an initial table expression that we hand it, intending to be a filter over a second set of columns. And so what this definition is saying is that it treats those columns that we provided in the table expression as if they were columns from other tables. And that's important because we don't really think about it when we're filtering between physical relationships. But when we want to use values from another table to filter another column with those same values in them in another table, it's not easy enough to just depend that those values that we see with our eyes are going to make that filtering happen. There's encoding under the covers, and it's called lineage in the model, which for Power BI purposes make those two columns that look identical completely different. But what TREATAS does is it looks at that table being filtered, those other tables, and it uses the lineage, or it uses the encoding specific to those columns and those values and applies them to the table expression that we handed it in expression 1. So I just want to point that out. Maybe I'll do a video on lineage in the future. All right, let's go on to our example. I'm going to go to the steps to calculate and just point out, because TREATAS is a table expression, it is positioned right here in step 4 in our filter arguments and calculate. That's important because we're going to have to understand what's happening when we get unexpected results against these prior steps in calculate. Our first example, and I've got pre-written out code because I've got a lot of I've got some pretty involved DAX with comments, but this first example is just a classic example of wanting to express shipped sales versus ordered sales. And so we've got sales that went out the door, valued on this day, 1/5. But then we also had orders placed on the same day, and those are represented by order date in our sales table. And we want to be able to contrast what went out the door with what was ordered in that same day. Classic example, we use a calculate modifier called use relationship. And so we're going to see this measure right here where we've got the shipped product measure, but we've modified it through calculate to use a different relationship. What's required when we use relationship, of course, is a relationship, but not an active one. We need an inactive relationship. So let's go to that part of the model and see that we've got a date table here, and we've got two relationships. One is our regular model active relationship from date to ship date, and that's where we're getting ship sales from. And then we have this inactive relationship that we created that filters between the date in the date table over the order date column in our sales table. That one is obviously inactive because we can't have two active relationships at the same time. But what that inactive relationship allows us to do is evaluate ordered product sales in this measure right here by calling on use relationship and then spelling out that relationship right there between date, our order date, and date. Use relationship does two things. It not only activates the inactive relationship that we saw back there, but it inactivates the active relationship. So I know that when I look at these totals down here, that these are the ordered totals. Now, we're going to see in our next example for commission that there are times where use relationships does not work with our published report. And so if I needed to do an alternative to use relationships, the first thing I would think of, because of its efficiency and its ability to transfer filters, is treat as. So I've got ordered product there, and then I pre-written this measure called order product treat as. And let's just take a look at the measure, and we'll see that instead of using use relationships, what I'm using is this table variable that comes from this table expression up here that I stored in this variable. Since treat as returns a table, it can be stored in a variable and then used in this calculate. This treat as takes the values, so this is my table expression from the date table, which is essentially taking the filtered context coming from this row right here in my visual, and it's applying this filtered date 1/8 up here over the fact table sales column order date. And so that's how I intend to get the ordered sales, is that I want that table argument right here to override original filter context, or those step one filters coming from the model canvas, and I want it to replace it with the date from the visual filtering through to the order date in my sales table. And if I can isolate those rows in sales order date, I should get the result of the amounts that were ordered. Well, you can already see down here that I don't get the expected result. I get occasional results, and it's correct at least, but I don't get results for the majority of these rows. This is part of the reason why I like learning from a small model like this, is because I can control and identify right away what's expected and what's not expected. All right, well, the first thing I would do here, if I had a blank here and a good result there, is I would take a look at these dates where I get good results, 1/1 and 1/10. If I go back to the table and I look at those dates in sales, and I start up here with 1/1, order date, ship date 1/1, this order was ordered and shipped out on the same day. And I know that in my treat as example, I got 150. The other date that showed results was down here for 1/10, and ironically, not ironically, they also shared the same date, 1/10. So now when I look up and I see all the other sales, orders and ships that were made, I observe that they were ordered on one date, shipped on another date. So I'm clued in to the fact that my treat as is working a little bit, but it's only working when these two dates match. Well, if we go back to our 5 steps to calculate, and we know that we put our treat as table right there as filter 4, and we go all the way back down to filter 1, it's obvious that these filters are combining. This is a different filter. So it's not that it's conflicting with the same filters from down here. In this case, it's adding to the filters that we see on the Canvas visual. So what happened when we had the use relationship example is that we used that calculate modifier here, and it reached down to the original filters coming from the canvas, flowing through the active relationship in our model. And it came down here and it deactivated that model filter. So that canvas filter coming from the canvas here was inactive. And all that was remaining was the active inactive filter in use relationship. And so that's why we were confident in seeing all the ordered sales. So we obviously have to do the same here. Putting the table argument here does not automatically go down and overwrite this. We have to add to our measure and deactivate that original filter. A way that we can do that is we can go back here, go back to our measure, and all we have to do is add remove filters over the date table. And when we do so, you'll see that those values come back. Why did we go through all this trouble to change a measure that was working perfectly? Well, we're going to move on to this commission example where we're wanting to use relationship in the same way, but this time it's to create a roll-up for sales that fall under our supervisors. So let me show you the table first. I've got a table that represents commission reps. Well, that table has a mixture of sales reps in my organization as well as supervisors here. So Dan is a supervisor, Sarah is a supervisor. And they're classified or they're identified in this table under the roles. So you can see I have supervisor role, supervisor right there, and everyone else is field sales. Well, in this model, I've got that rep table filtering down through my sales table. And they're attached by sales rep number. My supervisors have a rep number, 101 and 105, even though they have no sales in that table. And my inactive filter is over the supervisor column in sales. I'm filtering sales rep because my supervisors also have a sales rep. But this time I want to divert from the original filter over sales rep field and sales. And I want to shift over to filtering that supervisor column in my sales table. I'll show you that that commission sales table has a column for sales rep as well as supervisor. So when I'm using that user relationships, I'm grouping all of these sales for Dan under 101, and then all of these sales here for Sarah under 105. All right. Well, I've used use relationships here. I pre-written this measure. That's a little big. But you can see here that I'm evaluating in this first variable to select the value in the role column of the rep table. So I'm looking at every selected role in that table or returning blank if it's not selected. And then in this measure, I'm just simply creating the default sales measure. I don't even need a calculate there. There's no reason to have two calculates. Remember, one is hidden. And then I've got a version of sales that represent when I hit a supervisor. And so that's when I need to calculate, and I'm going to evaluate total sales as my expression. And then as a filter argument, use that calculate modifier, use relationship to activate that relationship, that inactive relationship between sales rep and supervisor in sales to evaluate the rolled up amounts under each supervisor for their employees. And then the final result variable here just says if I'm on a supervisor, return the rolled up sales under supervisor in the sales table. Otherwise, I just want to see field sales based on the sales rep number that's also a separate column in that sales table. I hit return. Use relationships seems to work great. This is something I actually did at work. So this is a real life example. I published this to the service, and then I got a call pretty quick from one of the supervisors and said, hey, your report's broken. And it was because when they were viewing this report under their row level security role, the measure use relationships was breaking the report. And the reason why use relationships is breaking the report here with row level security is because, remember, use relationships activated an inactive relationship and then deactivated this active relationship that row level security was depending on as a global report level filter over the model for Dan or for the supervisors that had a role in this report. So that's a bummer. That's obviously not going to work. And that's why I started looking for an alternative to using use relationships using TREATAS. And so I've got a TREATAS sales measure here that I'm going to just walk through and then we're going to drag in. But what I want to point out about this as an alternate to use relationships, what's cool about this is that I'd never thought of using TREATAS against two columns within the same table. I've always learned TREATAS as the ability to create a virtual relationship or transfer filters between two separate tables. I never thought of using TREATAS within the same table. So you'll notice here I've got the same variables up here until we get down to this table variable here, which is TREATAS. And you can see I created a values expression over the sales reps in the rep table, com rep table. And I wanted to treat those when I'm on a supervisor as a filter over supervisor in that same table. So instead of transferring this filter from the rep table down into the supervisor column in sales, I'm doing it within the same table, the same dimension table. And what's cool about this is that it allows me to avoid having to have or materialize that supervisor column in that sales table. If I always tell my students, you got to pretend you got 100 million rows in sales. Do you want to add an additional column to your sales table if you can avoid it? And in this case, if this is all I use this TREATAS for, then I can use it over the same rep table and get rid of all of those column values that represent supervisor in my sales table. So I thought that was really cool. Everything else is the same. I've got the expression. I'm using my TREATAS table argument. And then, of course, I have to deactivate those original filters coming from the canvas to get it to work appropriately. And then my result says, if you're on a supervisor, evaluate this measure here. Again, I'll take the calculate out. Otherwise, we're going to be pulling on the simple measure up here for field rep sales. I hit return. I bring that into my model. It shows identical results. I can cancel this use relationships, and then I can go up to my view as roles, and this time I can write, or I can click on Dan, and it protects me from that error over that active relationship with use relationship. All right, last example. This one is fun too. This one also represents a real life example. We at my work, we have customer-facing Power BI reports that we share with them. And what we do is we want to share information with them, but we also want them on the customer side to input their revenue from their end. And then what we use with both sides, the cost and the revenue, cost coming from us, of course, it's our sales to them, and then revenue from their side. We use these two values to generate a margin percentage, and it's a KPI for them on their profit portal. Well, what I didn't like about this is that you can imagine that the customers aren't always timely in entering their side of the profit margin equation. And so they may lag 1 or 2 months behind the amount of sales that we sold them that reflects their cost in this margin. So our costs or our sales update daily. However, they may be back a month. Well, you can see the impact on margin percentage here. What ends up happening is sales to them continue, and then it continues diluting their margin to the point where they can go negative on their gross profit margin, because all you need in this example is an additional month of cost without revenue to push this negative. Well, here's another use of TREATAS. And so what we did was, instead of writing just a simple sum of what they purchased from us, we had to turn this into a measure that represented sales to them, but only on the relevant months where they had filled in their side of the equation. And so to do this, I wrote a calculate table variable up here. And what I'm trying to do here is create a table expression that only represents the months and the year field in their production table where they've entered valid revenue on their side. And so I've got values representing month year under the current filter context, but only when their production revenue column does not equal blank. And so regardless of if I pre-populate their worksheet with all the month and years for the next 2 years, it's only going to pick up the months and years when they have valid revenue filled in. And then what I can do is turn that into a treat as table here, where I say I want to treat those values under the filter context up here with valid revenue as filters over the dimension date, month, year. And so if we go back to our model, just real quick, if we go back to our KPI model, what you'll see is I've got 2 fact tables, the sales and the production, and I've got relationships from date to date here for their production. This is where they're storing their revenue. And then I have another active relationship between date and the ship date. Well, what I'm doing is coming down here and querying the valid month years with revenue, and I'm applying those as filters through my date table up here. Well, that in turn reduces the rows in my date table, and that propagates down to sales and only gives me the valid months that revenue is filled in for. I didn't have to create a relationship or try to create a relationship between sales and production. I was able to accomplish that through the treat as. So let's bring that measure in, only product month sales, and you can see that it works. It lines up perfectly with customer revenue. And then now for our margin equation, all I have to do is create a revised margin here. That is just like this, except instead of using ship product, I'm going to replace this with my only product sold. That's all I have to do besides changing this. Okay, I'm going to hit enter, and voila, like magic, we've got 24.3, which is the weighted average between the margin calculated here and in February. All right. And then, of course, with that, we can get rid of that column. And we have this nice table where it doesn't prevent us from showing total ship product. But when it comes to the KPI or the ratio here, it's relevant all the way through down to our grand total. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please push like and even consider subscribing to the channel. I would very much appreciate it. I thank you for getting to the end of the video and sticking with it, and we'll see you next time. Bye.